The Honourable David Parker.
Mr Chairman, can I rise to speak in support of the supplementary order paper in my name, which adds Part 6 to this bill? Can I make the point that this prolonged debate of all of these other necessary measures that would be important to solve the housing crisis, every one of which the National Party is voting against, is only being protracted because the government, under urgency, pushed through Part 2 of this bill, which takes away, without select committee consideration, the property right of people who have a residual interest in a property that was compulsorily acquired from the Crown, and the government, having said that's already the law, is passing a law to take it away. It's obviously hard to believe that that's already the law if that's what they're doing. Sir, if it hadn't been for that, the government could be progressing with other business. If they want to still refer that to select committee and put that through a decent process, they should come and talk to us. Sir, this part of the bill is a very important part of the Labor Party's policies to reduce the cost of new housing, which, as my colleague Phil Twyford points out, flows through to the cost of all other housing because, as we know, markets clear at the marginal cost of the new. If there is a shortage, if the marginal cost of the new is higher than it would otherwise be, it not only lifts the cost of the new, it flows through to all of the alternative purchases, which are the cost of the old. So if you've got excessive land costs and excessive capital infrastructure costs up front in a new subdivision, then that flows to the cost of all housing in a place where you've got urban population growth, as we have in Auckland, sir. Perhaps the thought leader in this in the world, or one of them, is Professor Ed Gleisner from Harvard University. He was brought out by the University of Auckland Business School a couple of years ago to address New Zealand on what you need to do to have good cities that service the needs of the population, particularly in growing cities. He's the author of a book called Triumph of the City. Sir, I went to his lecture in Auckland and he made three important points. He said that if you want to keep... before I turn to that, I would make the point that it is absurd that in a country that has got as much land as New Zealand and as few people, that we have amongst the most expensive land or land inflation in the world. It's a truism. It's, we've got a land area that's the size of the United Kingdom, about the size of Italy. We've got less than 1/10 of their population, and yet we're the ones that have got problems with with house prices and land inflation. It's not because we're short of land, it's because the government settings are wrong, including around the planning of the release of land. Now, you hear defenders of urban growth limits say, well, there's a lot of land planned for release. In fact, Auckland City, in their own defence, they say we're rezoning an area the size of Hamilton and therefore all these problems will be cured. The problem is that actually they release that extra land zoned in tiny little increments so as to drive, from their point of view, the efficient use of infrastructure, and in the process they are always captured by land bankers, because land bankers know where they're going next. The 10-year long-term council plan shows where the infrastructure is going in next. And so around the margins of that growth, the price of land is held high because the market is never fully supplied with land in the face of the shortage that we've had for some years. So Gleisner says two things. He says three things actually that I think are really important in this debate. First of all, he says that urban growth boundaries are inappropriate because they constrain supply in the face of population growth and drive up prices. Secondly, he said that rules that limit the natural intensification that will occur within an existing city are even worse because they drive up prices and they stop people doing what they naturally want to do, which is populations grow. They actually want to live in reasonably compact cities. And thirdly, he says that you have to be very, very, very careful that you don't transfer the cost of infrastructure inappropriately either to existing ratepayers as a future ratepayer to them, or also, one of the other reasons you don't want to do that is you distort the price signals across the whole of your country, and you actually ruin the regional development of other places, Mr. Chairman. You ruin the regional development in other places who should be gaining an advantage if prices are on the rise in a city like Auckland. You would expect that other cities and other regions would be developed as a substitute for some of that more expensive development in Auckland. And you don't get that right if you don't get the pricing of infrastructure right. So, sir, what this says, this requires that a national policy statement be drafted by the Minister, that's the Minister for the Environment, under the RMA, within 6 months of the section coming into effect. That national policy statement would then go through the normal processes under the RMA and would effectively impose rules upon district and regional councils that stopped these practices that at the moment are driving up land prices and therefore house prices. Mr. Chairman, the Labor Party has been pointing out that this is necessary now for about 3 years. Our response has become increasingly sophisticated in the last couple of years through Phil Twyford's efforts and other people's, and I hope I've made a contribution there. But it actually goes back to when Annette King was our housing spokesperson and David Shearer was our leader, when we first said that we actually needed a national policy statement in respect of affordable housing under the RMA. As my colleague Phil Twyford has pointed out, for years we have had the National Party bleating on that the RMA is the cause of these problems. Actually, in truth, if used properly, the RMA is the solution to these problems, because national policy statements are provided for under the RMA and should be used when there is an issue of national importance, such as a housing shortage, that needs to be overcome through changes to planning rules, which the government has always had the ability to do through a national policy statement under the RMA. I want to deal with a point that Julianne Genter raised, because it's a very important point. She makes the point that you've got to be careful that you don't drive inappropriate forms of urban form that increase pollution, waste infrastructure, cause people to sit in cars longer, increase the cost of public transport because you've got to extend public transport networks, or increase the operating costs of public transport because they're less efficiently used. That is the purpose of these subclauses C and D and E of Clause 2 of this amendment under new section 46C. Sir, it says that central government should list all of the infrastructure costs. That includes libraries and swimming pools, the extensions to public transport, the extensions to local roads, the inefficient use of central government motorways. All of these things should be properly measured. Now, you won't recover the cost of all of them, but you should be properly measuring the marginal cost of growth so that you can make a rational decision. Then, sir, you should have some standard rules that work across the country as to how you allocate those costs. That is how you get the right economic signal to drive appropriate urban form without allowing the land bankers to capture the land market and drive land prices to the ridiculous levels that we have in New Zealand, where despite being a country that is so rich in terms of our land area, we have these incredibly high this incredibly high inflation. So the Labor Party was onto this before the National Party. We're onto it before the Productivity Council started to think of it. We are, in many ways, more considered in our use of markets than the government. The government claims that they know how to work markets. These are rules-based markets. The rules are in district plans. If the market is not working, you need to change the rules. It is that simple. But the National Party do not understand that in order to use and harness the private sector and the public sector to solve this housing crisis that we have in New Zealand, that we have to harness those markets through appropriate rules relating to the urban limit, sir. That's what this supplementary order paper in my name does, sir. We have artificial land scarcity in New Zealand because we all know that we've got a lot of it. It's just that people aren't allowed to build on it. Sir, blaming the RMA has always been wrong. The RMA is where the solution lies.